So, hello everyone. My name's Todd. I'm a former pilot with Thomas Cook Airlines, and it's a pleasure to be here today for our expert talk with Caroline Hickman, who's a practicing psychotherapist and lecturer at the University of Bath. So, without further ado, I'll hand over now to Caroline to hear from her for the next half hour or so. Thanks for coming, Caroline.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks for keeping that intro short. They are painful if they go on too long. So I'm going to start with an apology, and I hope you understand. Stay with me on this. So, on the one hand, I need to be comfortable with the idea of being called an expert on this, and that's fine. I'll learn that. I've been working in this field for 15, 20 years, both as an academic doing research, and I'm going to introduce a bit of that later, and also as a clinical psychotherapist. Been working in mental health for over 40 years. And the reason I just want to qualify this statement at the start and the definition of myself as an expert is I'm only just starting to wrap my head around what we're dealing with in terms of the psychology and the mental health impact of climate change. So I do apologize, but I think we have to have the humility to recognize that what we're dealing with here in both practical scientific engineering terms and also in psychological terms is unprecedented. And just recognizing that actually puts us on a good footing to then find out about it and then figure out what to do about it. We're only beginning to recognize the psychological mental health impact of the climate and ecological emergency in recent years. I think it's the 2022 IPCC report was the first time it was named. Up until that point, understandably, the physical impact, wildfires, floods, was emphasized because it's tangible. We can see it, touch it, respond to it. And that's very relevant for your industry, isn't it? But the mental health impact we've been much slower to start to recognize. And one of the difficulties with that, and I think this is relevant for your industry, is there's a tendency to keep going back to established ways of dealing with things and applying them to this crisis, the climate crisis. And it doesn't always work because this is genuinely unprecedented. And that's a very overused word. Generally, it can make us all roll our eyes, but this is genuinely unprecedented. Humanity, so I'm absolutely presenting the psychosocial, psychological, social impact of this. The practical side of things, I'm going to leave to the people who are much more qualified than me to deal with the practicalities. But I can absolutely bring you expertise around what happens to our mental health, what happens to our relationships, and how do we navigate this. And I am going to say that if we try and use old established ways of dealing with things like anxiety, depression, PTSD, they don't apply neatly to the climate crisis. And so they fail us, they let us down. One of the reasons for that is we're in the middle of the story of the climate ecological crisis. We're not at the beginning of the story, we're not at the end of the story. We're right in the middle of the story. It's too late to prevent it from happening. It's not too late to change the end of the story. But we struggle to really understand that and really see that. So what we do with that stress psychologically is we push things forwards into the future. I will deal with that when it's a crisis. It's already a crisis, but people don't want to recognize that. One of the reasons we struggle to recognize that, particularly in the global north, is we are not facing the direct physical impact as acutely as people elsewhere in the world are. We'll come back to that in a minute because we are absolutely facing the psychological and cognitive, mental thinking impact, but we don't fully recognize it. So we need to kind of, what can we do about this, practically speaking? And this is what I'm doing, is trying to bring that into conscious awareness, trying to help people become aware of this. The more knowledge we've got of this and the way we address this, the way we approach it, and the way we defend against it, because it's very, very uncomfortable, the better tools we've got to deal with it. I'm just looking for the book that I should have had a bit closer. Hang on. Of course, it wasn't exactly where I wanted it. And I just want to read you this, just to illustrate what I'm talking about. So, we live in perilous times, and you're probably far too informed as a group and knowledgeable as a group to completely fall for this. But I am going to ask you to think, when was this written? We live in perilous times. The peril is of our own making, and many of us probably deserve it. But the children and the native peoples of this world, and most important, all the other species sashaying around in this great dance of life, do not deserve the peril we've created. The ecologist Raymond Dasman says that World War III has already begun, and this is the war of industrial humans against the earth. He's correct. All of us are warriors on one side or another in this war. There are no sidelines. There are no civilians. Ours is the last generation that will have the choice of wilderness, clean air, abundant wildlife, and expansive forests. The crisis is that severe. What's important is you do something now. So you are not going to completely fall for that, because we are hearing those narratives currently. It's a contemporary narrative. But this was written in the 1960s, which is before quite a lot of people on this call were even born. It was published in 1991. Confessions of an Eco-Warrior by Dave Foreman. And this is what is so difficult to wrap our heads around and to understand and to fully comprehend, is that that was in public knowledge for decades. We've also had the solutions for decades and failed to fully act on them. And yes, we have to go to political, technological, rational arguments about that. And of course, that's all true. There's all sorts of obstacles to that action. But there are also psychological obstacles and relational obstacles. And that's my field. That's what I can help us think about. I'm going to leave the arguing and debating and finding a way through the technological solutions to the people like yourselves who know far more about this than I do. What I can do is help bring in the psychology. And if you put the psychology alongside your technological knowledge and your knowledge of business, then you might get somewhere. So, a couple of really important things to set the scene here. Psychologically, we are having to measure both short-term impact and long-term impact. Both of those two things are happening simultaneously. And again, that is incredibly difficult for us to wrap our heads around, because we are used to dealing with short-term crises, but this is both short-term and long-term at the same time. We also have to wrap our heads around the fact that we have direct and indirect effects of climate change affecting us in terms of our mental health. Again, at the same time, we prefer things to be simplified as either or, either direct or indirect. And that's one of the ways we manage the stress around this for ourselves. We say, oh, well, direct impact of the fires in LA. We can easily measure that and quantify it and see the impact of that. But I am going to argue, and I'll show you some statistics in a minute, to show the indirect impact of that, witnessing it, hearing about it, has just as significant a cognitive impact on people sat elsewhere around the world as it does on people in LA. They have the physical impact to deal with and the direct impact. The indirect impact is just as severe elsewhere around the world. What we're looking at in terms of mental health impact is a range of mental health difficulties. And I'm going to be very, very clear right from the start that it is not a mental illness to have any mental health response to what's happening in terms of climate and the biodiversity crises. It's not a mental illness. It's a mentally healthy response to what's going on. We measure mental health by looking at our capacity to respond to external reality. And external reality is showing us more and more and more that things are getting worse, more severe. Therefore, it would be a mentally healthy response to react to that, to respond to that. I would worry about people that didn't, quite honestly. I would go so far as to say I think everyone on the planet has some form of climate anxiety or climate distress. The post is about to be delivered, which may wake up the small dog, and he may act like there's a pack of wolves at the door. So don't worry if you hear any reaction from the small dog who's currently asleep. We absolutely want to feel in control of this in mental, in emotional terms, and we absolutely don't. We've got, and we're struggling to know how to define that, but it is a mentally healthy response to feel different forms of distress, whether it's anxiety, whether it's vicarious trauma, trauma of seeing what's happening to other people, post-traumatic stress disorder. The philosopher Timothy Morton says we should also consider pre-traumatic stress disorder, the anticipation of what's coming down the road, what's heading our way. And complicated grief. It's very similar to the grief that's often being felt in relation to things like COVID, where we can't grieve in a straightforward way. We can't just feel sad and grief because it's complicated by the fact that it's partly human caused and there's a government response involved in that. And then there's conspiracy theories swirling around, which complicate it. And then you've got individual grief, and then you've got collective grief. So it's complicated. We cannot have a straightforward grief. So what I was saying was, I think everyone on the planet feels some anxiety and distress in response to this, and it's a mentally healthy response, except for a very, very small group of people who don't feel very much at all. But we're not going to include them in this narrative, in this discussion. I don't want to offend anybody when we're talking about economic pressure, recession, COVID. These are genuine global threats. But on the scale of things, I'm sure you're familiar with this kind of scaling. In response to climate change, biodiversity collapse, these previous threats that humanity globally has faced are relatively small. And I'm not dismissing them and I'm not minimizing them, not for 1 second. They're genuinely destructive and devastating, but they're nothing compared to the bigger picture. Now, how do we wrap our heads around that? One of the main things we do is minimize it. We go into a form of disavowal. We go into a form of denial. And we try to say, oh, well, it'll be all right because one of my favorites, technology will save us. Yeah. Or the government will save us. Or we disavowal is actually the biggest obstacle. There isn't that much pure climate denial roaming around anymore, except maybe in that little group of sociopaths who genuinely don't care about anything at all. Thankfully, there's very few of them. The majority of people will use the defense of what's called disavowal, where on the one hand, with one part of their psyche, their mind, they'll say, yeah, this is a real big problem. This is really worrying, and we've got to do something. We've got to do this and this and this. And then with the other part of their brain, they say, oh, well, yes, but it'll be all right because humanity is innovative and we've dealt with this before. And oh, we can have wind farms, or oh, we'll go to nuclear power. So you reduce your anxiety and your distress by looking for a simplified, quick and easy solution. And it reduces the anxiety, but it doesn't make it go away. And then you have to go around again. I hope I'm making sense. Feel free at the end. Let me just talk and throw all this at you because we haven't got very long. But feel free at the end to go, yeah, don't agree with you, don't like this. Yeah, we can have a robust conversation about this at the end. Antonio Guterres is one of the only world leaders who's able to speak overtly and directly about this. The majority are caught by their role, their position as politicians and wanting to be re-elected. He's not in that position, so he speaks very directly. He says facts are undeniable. This is in 2022. Abdication of leadership is criminal. This emphasis from him on leadership is important, and it's really important for you because you have a position, a responsibility of leadership in your industry. The world's biggest polluters are guilty of arson of our only home. He's able to name it in that unashamed, clear way. Not many people are. Now, the reason I kind of not push away this kind of expertise whilst claiming it at the same time, life is not simple, is over 40 years working in mental health, in frontline mental health, social work, psychiatry, psychotherapy, research, teaching. And I am still being surprised at what people are saying to me about the psychological impact of the climate crisis on them. I'm still learning. This is a young woman. She's very happy for me to quote her. In the United States, late 20s, working in the sustainability industry, engineer, heavily involved in making a big positive difference in her industry, in her world, and very, very distressed by the climate crisis. And she said to me last year, she said, I wish I was mad. And I said to her, do you really? I mean, do you know what you're wishing for? Because this is not a nice thing to wish for. She said, yeah. She said, because if I was mad, she said, I'd know how to deal with that. She said, and my family and other people around me would understand insanity, but they don't understand my climate distress. And they dismiss it or send me a positive video about, sustainability and engineering. She said, and it doesn't help me feel better. She said, it just makes me feel they don't get it. I'm going to talk more about the different scale of climate distress and climate anxiety in a minute, but from mild to medium to significant and critical, she struggles with very severe climate distress. So we need to think about all of this as a hyperobject, which is a term you might be familiar with. It means we have to look at this phenomena from all these different angles, all at the same time. It makes your head spin. Personal, it's personal. It's family, it's social, it's collective, it's national, it's international, it is political, and it is planetary, all at the same time. And it can absolutely make your head spin because you kind of focus in on one part and think, right, we can do X, Y, Z about this. And then somebody says, yeah, but what about plastics in the ocean? You go, right, yep, we've got to take that into account. And then someone says, yeah, but what about heat domes in the US? And you go, right, yeah, let's put that in the mix too. It's very hard. This is a very movable situation that we're dealing with. So we have massive uncertainty being generated as a result. Now, okay, quick psychology lesson on how humans deal with uncertainty. We hate it. We absolutely hate it. The human ego wants control and wants certainty, yeah, to a degree of arrogance frequently, where we think we can engineer our way out of absolutely every single problem in the world. Well, many of them we can, but not all of them. It's kind of partly why we're in this mess in the first place. So, what do we do with this longing, this need for certainty? We split and we turn it into what's called a false binary. And people go to one extreme or the other. So, I'm going to exaggerate to make a point. At one end of this spectrum, you've got catastrophic apocalyptic thinking. It's all over, it's all hopeless, it's all doom and gloom. What's the point? Let's just go and, be a prepper in the Arizona desert and learn to shoot, or open an insect farm in mid Wales. Not that there's anything wrong with that, or either of those, if that's what you need to do. But it's an apocalyptic worldview where it's hopeless and you get called a doomer. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum, I hope I'm not boring you, giving you this psychology. You've got this naive optimism. Oh, it's going to be fine. The government will save us. Technology will save us. Nuclear power. These are the same solution because all we're doing there with either of those positions is reducing our anxiety about uncertainty. And there's grains of truth in both of those, but neither of those are completely true on their own. My personal favorite, there is a group, and I'm quite fond of them. There is a group that believes that at the point of greatest collapse and destruction, aliens will descend to the earth and rescue us. Now, I really like this group because in my mind, that is no different to the belief that we are attached to government will save us or nuclear power will save us. It's that attachment to a power outside ourselves, which reduces our anxiety. And once we've got that certainty, no matter how irrational it is, we are going to hold on to it. And this is going to be one of the things that you struggle with in your work with Safe Landing when you're trying to get people to see the other side of an argument and they are holding on to something. It's because they're terrified. They're going to hang on because we can't see this. It's the only ammunition I've got, which is finding different ways to help people see and understand what's going on. We're swimming in this water, so we struggle to see it. As a group, I'm going to make the assumption that you are more aware. Of course, you see it, otherwise you wouldn't be sat here talking with us today. So you've got much more awareness, but part of your work is going to be about getting people to see it who don't even know that there are goldfish in a bowl swimming in water. How do you get people to see that? You can't just sit there and go, you're a goldfish in a bowl swimming in water. Because they're going to be like, well, I don't think I am. I'm a bird flying in the air. And you're like, oh, not from where I'm sitting. So we're dealing with profound attachment to sometimes deeply irrational arguments. And that's because people are terrified. And when people are terrified, they hang on to anything and everything, no matter how insane it is. A couple of words from Paul Hoggart. He was one of the founders of the Climate Psychology Alliance, which is uh, a group that anyone is welcome to go along to. There's tons of resources on the website. Go and have a rummage about and help yourself. And anyone is welcome to join. You don't have to be a psychologist. There's a couple of words which I think help illustrate what we're dealing with. This is tragedy which is unfolding in front of our eyes, and we are witnessing something whilst living within it. And it's really hard. We can relate to things that are in the past, and we can relate to things more in the future. When we're in the midst of something, we frequently don't know how to feel and what to think. And Gus Speth, you might be familiar with this quote from him in, I think it was his 2013. He's an environmental lawyer. He said, I used to think top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. And with 30 years good science, we can deal with that. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And still with those, we need spiritual and cultural transformation. He said, and we scientists don't know how to do that. This was 2013. I think increasingly scientists, engineers, academics do know how to do that. It's just not easy and it's not straightforward, but that's what we're finding out. Sally Weintraub is also well worth reading. She talks about neoliberal capitalism and the culture of uncare in relation to climate change. And when people do show concern, this is often met by people in power with silence or indifference or attack. And you will be familiar with this if ever you've tried to have conversations with people who just attack you because you're making them uncomfortable. And they just call you, I don't know, a tree hugger. That's a polite way of calling you names. And this is this culture of uncare, which comes from neoliberal capitalism. So if you're interested, there's a lot of stuff online from her. She makes that argument far more eloquently than I will ever do. And humor is a positive defense, a mature defense. We can excuse my language, but I am not uncomfortable with the language of war around this. But we can weaponize psychology. It's been weaponized in the industry, particularly the oil industry, to dismiss and misinformation and disinformation to allow things to remain unchanged for a long time. We can do the same. She's saying, give me a hand moving these from the fiction to the non-fiction section. We can't afford to be too nice about this. So I think I've pretty much said this, but so one of the key things about any form of, and I really don't care what people call this, whether it's eco-anxiety or eco-depression or eco-despair, You can call it whatever you like. I really don't mind. What I want is for people to understand it. And crucial to understanding it. And I used to think that eco anxiety was the anxiety we felt in relation to climate change. And it begins there, but it doesn't stop there. It is that that triggers it, but it is then the non-response or the dismissal and the denial of people around us, and particularly for younger generations, it is linked to adult inaction. So for us adults, it's linked to the inaction of people in power, and that makes it a relational trauma. So when we were trying to do research around this in 2020, 2021, we're thinking it's all very well saying this is what it's not, but we've got to come up with something that this is what it is. So we recognized that it was closely related to what we would call moral injury. And this has been well researched in soldiers going to war, believing in their cause, believing in what they're doing, absolute faith that they're on the right side. Same with medics. And we saw medics and nursing staff suffer from this, particularly during COVID, where they are absolutely believing that what they're doing is the right thing. And then at some point, there's a turning point and they feel betrayed. They feel let down by the people in power. And what's broken and what's hurt in that moment, you have the loss of faith in others who you feel have betrayed you or lied to you or abandoned you. And you feel that you've been asked to do something which goes against your morality and against your values. And that is really hard to square. And we see the impact of that, particularly with PTSD in, people leaving the armed forces and medics. And I suspect it's equally relevant for people leaving the aviation industry and feeling just completely betrayed and unable to square for themselves how they've lived with what they now know. We need absolute sympathy for just how painful that can be. And it's not your fault. You've not caused this. So 5 more minutes and then I'm going to shut up. How are we responding? So this is my big sell on it's okay to be depressed. It's okay to feel sad. It's okay to feel blame, anger, frustration, guilt, shame, grief. It's okay to have fantasies of rescue. These are all mentally healthy responses. It's okay to feel hope and it's okay to feel hopeless. You just don't want to feel it all on the same day and not all at the same time. We need the external action, but we also need this internal development of emotional resilience and emotional intelligence, which helps us navigate how complex this stuff is. And we need to understand it. And if somebody that you're working with feels rage and anger and you just feel guilt and grief, and somebody else feels sad and somebody else feels anxious, none of you are wrong. You're all right. And frequently what happens is people move around between these emotions. And I tried to map this, and it's an oversimplification, and it's two-dimensional. It really needs to be three-dimensional. You need to imagine this as a slinky where we move around, we move through these emotions. When you wake up to what's going on, the more aware you become, the more emotionally you will struggle. That's the price you pay. So I don't want to get rid of that emotion. The last thing I want to do is get rid of people's anxiety or sadness or despair, but I want to show them how to navigate it. You can't get rid of it. If you try and suppress it and push it away, it's just going to come back with a vengeance, twice as angry. And then you just go through a cycle of secondary emotional self-criticism, self-hatred. And then you end up with anxiety about your anxiety or depression about your depression. Let's not go down that road. All of these emotions are valuable, and the depression and the collapse and despair is valuable. Just don't set up home there in the bottom of that cycle. Don't stay there. Don't get stuck there. But it's valuable. But you just don't want to spend too long there. You will get stuck there if you try and stop yourself from going there, or if you tell yourself when you've got there, there's something wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with you. It's a perfectly healthy response to what's going on in the world. Just don't build a house there. What helps us move through that is recognizing this uncertainty, these multiple uncertainties, connecting with community, listening to people, feeling understood by other people, framing this as meaningful climate justice, reframing it, a radical acceptance, radical hope, not a naive hope. We might be going off a cliff, but we can go down fighting. Imagining different futures, having the courage to imagine powerfully different futures. Again, this is in your hands. And moving forwards, what I can do to help with that is give you this message of building the emotional resilience to navigate that is what helps. And then you're at a higher level of functioning psychologically on the far side of that than when you went in. 2 more minutes, then I promise, going to shut up. Different range of emotions. Some people feel this very mildly, where you can respond to reassurance. But the more aware you become, sometimes, and the more action you take, you can still be left feeling awful. At its worst end, there are young people that I'm working with who are suicidal. And it's not that they want to die, they just don't know how to live in the world where they feel not cared about. That we can do something about today by saying to people, which is fundamentally my message here, it's okay to feel the way you feel. We get it. Now, what can we do about it? We need that kind of response to these emotions. And I just want to show you a couple of figures, and then I promise I'll shut up. So this was the research we did in 2021, 10,000 young people in 10 different countries, age 16 to 25. There's a reason to show you this. So, impact on daily living. No surprises. India, Philippines, impact on daily living, eating, sleeping, going to school. Huge impact on daily living if you live in countries like that. Relatively less in the UK, only 28%, US, 26%. Not facing so much of the direct physiological impact of climate change. But let me show you where we do face it. Interestingly, the emotion, we talk about climate anxiety, but actually the highest rated emotional response was sadness. But calling it climate sadness is not going to sell newspapers, so climate anxiety is much catchier. But it's really important to note that the majority of people feel sad when they connect with how this feels, and afraid, then anxious. So I just want to show you the cognitive impact, because this is, so security being threatened. Here you've got the worldwide figure, 52%, only 39% UK. Security is not such an issue in the UK or the US or across Europe yet. But let me show you, because this is the indirect impact. Relationally, 8 out of 10, 83% worldwide, 80% UK. Here, the UK figures catch up. Think that people have failed to take care of the planet. So we are not protecting young people from the cognitive indirect impact of climate change by reassuring ourselves, which I'm sure you're not doing, that they're in the US or Europe or the UK, so it's not that bad yet. It's not actually protective. 75% worldwide think the future is frightening, 73% UK think the future is frightening. Over half think humanity is doomed. 56% worldwide. 51% UK. So do you see my argument? Being physically at a distance does not protect us from the mental health impact. And for me, the misunderstanding around that is crucial, because it leaves people feeling there's something wrong with them, that they are that distressed. There's nothing wrong with you. You're the mentally healthy ones. You only feel climate distress, anxiety, sadness, because you care. And you should be proud that you care. So I want to reframe climate distress, take it out of the Western medical model and say, you should be proud that you have this distress. We're not going to get rid of it. What we do need to do is learn how to navigate it. It's about being okay with not feeling okay. Right, we're going to stop. I keep saying I'll stop talking, and I would just keep going forever. So I'm going to stop. And let's we've got comments, questions.